Hello, all. My name is Alex Smith. I'm with ABS Commercial based in Raleigh, North Carolina. We are a full brewhouse equipment supplier. So we sell everything from brew houses to fermenters, break tanks. Basically, if it's stainless steel, we can do it. We also own and operate Raleigh Brewing Company here in Raleigh, which is a 20-barrel production brewery. So that's kind of all of our background comes from being brewers ourselves and using our equipment day to day. So today we're going to talk about designing and selecting your equipment. We're going to focus today on brew houses, and we'll touch on cellar equipment a little bit towards the end. But mainly today we're going to be talking about brew houses. We're actually on our third iteration of Brewhouse here at Raleigh Brewing Company, kind of based on some of the things we're going to talk about today. So if you are in the market for a new brew house, if you're opening a new brewery, if you're expanding your current one, opening a new location, hopefully there should be a lot of good information for you to consider. So some of our main considerations, first and foremost, number and type of vessels. So I guess I should kind of start all of this by saying, how much beer do you want to make? That's one of the first things that we ask people. A lot of times we'll have folks come to us and say, I want a 5-barrel brew house. Okay, why? I don't know, because somebody down the street has a 5-barrel brew house and they seem to be doing well. That's awesome and good for them, but this is your own business and you really want to have your own metrics, your own business plan. So have an idea. We like to at least see how much beer do you want to make from year 1, 2, and 3. You can go to 5 or more. That's even better. But that baseline is really going to inform a lot of the decisions that we're going to talk about here. It's also going to inform us because we may be able to figure out, okay, you need to make X amount of beer depending on how your building looks. There's a lot of different variables that we'll go through. But sometimes actually a smaller brew house might be a better fit and enable you to make more beer and therefore more profit. So number and type of vessels. Basically, when we talk about brew houses, the main process is we're using a mash tun, we're separating with a lauter tun, or combining those two vessels, we're boiling, and then we're chilling. That's a basic brew process. So we can split those up or consolidate those processes to a degree. The most basic being a 2-vessel system, as we refer to it, which is a combination mash and lauter vessel. And then there's a kettle and whirlpool vessel. As you start to grow, and depending on the types of products that you're going to be creating, we may want to separate some of those processes. So, for instance, lager brewing, if you want to do decoction, that kind of thing, it may make more sense to have a mash mixer and then a separate lauter tun with a single kettle whirlpool. Alternatively, if you're making a lot of hazy IPAs, it may make the most sense to have a combination mash lauter and then separate your kettle and whirlpool. We can actually even install a heat exchanger between the kettle and the whirlpool vessel that's shell and tube. And that'll allow you to transfer straight into the whirlpool, knock down your temperature to a good hop rest temperature. So you can actually speed up your process, improve the quality of your beer, based on the design of your system. So knowing how much beer you want to make, what kind of beer you want to make, is very important to think about from the get-go, and it helps us a lot in designing your equipment. One of the second things to think about is, how are you going to heat everything? So when we talk about the brew house, we call that the hot side. We're heating it. Basically, our options there are steam, and steam can actually be either natural gas, propane, or electric. So you have some options there. The second option is direct fire. So that's basically building a clad vessel that has a burner directly underneath it that's gas fired. The burner is actually, even though we call it direct fire, it's not immediately in contact with the surface of the stainless steel that is, holding the liquid. It basically heats up a hot box, which is again a kind of a clad um, space below the vessel, and then that heat radiates up. So it's important to note because it is different than some of the more crude direct fire systems of the past, where you had very real risks of scorching your wort, a lot less control, a lot more localized heat. So our modern direct fire systems are actually a lot more versatile than ones of the past. So that's kind of something to think about and debunk a little bit if steam seems a little out of reach. The third option is electric. We generally do not do direct electric systems. For us at ABS Commercial, the smallest system that we make is a 3-barrel, which we really recommend only as a pilot system. It's very hard to make enough beer to be profitable on a 3-barrel system. And as you move up in size, even on a 5 or 7-barrel scale, the amount of amperage required to directly heat your boil kettle to a boil, but then also your double-sized hot liquor tank tends to outstrip the capacity of most buildings. It's also important to keep in mind the brewhouse generally is a very low percentage of your electric draw, unless you're using an electric system. So even if you think your building has plenty to power the brewhouse on a direct electric system, you need to think about how are you going to run, especially your glycol chiller. But then there's all these ancillary items like your canning line. Lights for your tap room. So it's very important to kind of consider that side as well. We also see a lot of issues with scorching, burned elements, that kind of thing on the electric side. In the kettle, those elements will also interfere with whirlpool, so you get very poor wort and trub separation. So those are some things to think about. I definitely feel like steam is my preference if you can get away with it. If you have the capacity, direct fire, as I said, is much improved, and we have a lot of breweries out in the wild making award-winning beers on direct fire systems. You do lack a little bit of control with a direct fire system, mainly on the mash tun. It is impossible to direct fire heat a mash lauter tun. So that means you're really not going to be able to do step mashes. You probably won't be able to do a really efficient mash out on a direct fire system, which you can with a steam system. So those are just kind of some things to consider on the heat source. As far as pricing goes, the actual equipment, even including the boiler, between a steam and direct fire system of the same size, is typically no more than a couple of $1,000s in either direction. The one big cost difference that you will see is that steam upfitting. So that is something that's very important to vet your contractors, make sure they understand what is required of that steam installation, because we've seen bids for the exact same job range from $15,000 to $60,000. Some people tend to overbuild it. Some people may not know what they're doing and think they're, kind of just installing an HVAC system. So it's important to really get a feel and make sure your contractor knows what isn't, included in that steam piping installation. And that's something that we are happy to work with you and your contractors to make sure, everything is being bid out appropriately. So moving on from heat sources, next big consideration is the level of automation. So obviously, making beer, consistency is key. You can be incredibly consistent with a fairly manual system. You can be a little more consistent, maybe, with a highly automated system. I'm a firm believer that operator is a big part of that. So either way, if you have a lazy brewer, you're probably not going to achieve a lot of consistency. I tend to go with more automation the bigger the system is and the more vessels the system is. So, for instance, on a 7 barrel, 2 vessel system, I would probably prefer a more manual system. Once you start entering the realm of PLC control, that kind of thing, we're talking $20,000 plus in added cost. And on a 7 barrel scale, you could probably get 3 or 4 more tanks, for your cellar for that same price point. And in my mind, if you are a professional brewer, you have good attention to detail, you should be able to make consistent, excellent beer with our manual systems. And when I say manual, all of our control panels have automated temperature control. So instead of using a PLC screen, you basically are working with switches and PID controllers. The manual element is opening and closing valves. We have really gone through about 8 designs at this point to optimize our manual pipe work based on our experience here at Raleigh Brewing Company to make sure the pipe work makes sense, it's highly integrated, it's easy and efficient to use. So on these kind of standard 2 vessel systems that we probably sell the most of, you kind of get the best of both worlds. It's a much lower cost. It's very easy to use. I really don't think you sacrifice much. But as we scale again into larger systems, multi-vessel systems, which inherently will put valves where they're hard to reach, that's when I start to kind of trend towards automation. So on these Brewhouse options, as we've kind of touched on, I see them into 2 different camps. There's your luxury items and your efficiency items. And a lot of this is going to come down to budget. A lot of it comes down to experience and personal preference as well. We have a lot of people who've been in the industry for a long time. They've worked on a specific type of system. And even if they know it isn't the best, it's what they're the most comfortable with, and that's what we'll build. On the opposite side, we may have people who want their brew house really as this kind of glitzy showcase in the tap room, and on a 7 barrel brew house, they want to spend $20,000 for a PLC system with pneumatic valves. And, they can basically press a button that says, make this recipe, and away they go. So a lot of that is up to you. Again, that luxury example, I would say, is a PLC panel, and yet you still have manual valves. It does look nice, and you can access it from your tablet, and it's all well and good. But at the end of the day, you're spending a good bit of money for something that doesn't, I think, add to the speed or quality of your brew process. As far as efficiency goes, these are things that we like to have in-depth conversations with you in terms of mainly what type of beer are you going to be making. So we are a full custom shop. We have our stock designs that work for, I would say, 80 to 85% of our customer base, in the craft beer industry. However, as we all know, the industry is diversifying. People are doing things that have never been done before. And we want to make sure that when you order a brew house from us, it is the right brew house for you, for your space, for the products that you're going to be making. So that's an important thing to let us or your supplier know. So a couple examples of that would be having an oversized mash water tun. If you plan on making a lot of high gravity beers. So we can sell you a 10-barrel brew house that has, for instance, a 15-barrel equivalent mash water tun. You will see a little bit of probably difficulty if you're trying to make 10 barrels of a 3% beer. However, you can always dilute, there's some workarounds there. But if you know that your focus is going to be high gravity beers, let's not undersize your mash tun from the start. And as an example, at our brewery here, one of our best-selling beers is a 9.2% Belgian Golden. And we have a 20-barrel brew house, but it's a 30-barrel mash tun that is designed specifically for that recipe because we make the most of that beer. And then we can scale everything appropriately to fit that mash tun and fit our system. Another good kind of efficiency item is a mounted grist case. If you have the ceiling height, I really like that option. It eliminates an auger run, which means you are no longer kind of beating up that grain more than you have to. You're also eliminating kind of a pinch point where during mash-in, if you're augering from a floor-mounted grist case or milling and then augering directly into your mash tun, that's what your limitation is how fast the auger can run. With the mounted grist case, you basically are relying on gravity. So your limitations are much less. You can typically mash in a good bit quicker, and you're never going to run into your auger clogging when you're in the middle of mash-in, for instance. Another thing that I really recommend people invest in as early as possible is getting a good mill. So we partner with RMS Mill, great company out of South Dakota. When we brought in our first RMS mill, upgraded from just kind of a conventional, essentially a farm mill, our efficiency went up about 8 or 9%. And based just on our production of that flagship Belgian beer, we calculated that extra 9% efficiency bump would pay for the $10,000 mill in about 6 months. And what we do now, we didn't actually reduce the amount of grain that we use. So we kept our recipe the same, but we're able to yield typically between 1 to 1.5 barrels more per batch per turn on the brew house. So even looking at that as, wholesale keg pricing, it adds up very quickly. So moving on to kind of your building and the configuration of the brew house, this is another thing that's important for you to kind of communicate and talk with your supplier about. Our standard design is typically linear on these 2 vessel systems, right? So everything's laid out in a nice clean row. If you want to put your brew house in the corner, however, a lot of times a triangle configuration will be better. So in the picture you can kind of see here, if you're watching, you would have the hot liquor tank kind of pushed into that corner, and then your mash lauter and your kettle whirlpool will be on the front. Another configuration element is the combo versus dedicated vessels. So the picture we're looking at right now, this is a pretty custom system for us. So not only is the mash tun and kettle flipped, but this is also a combo system. So you're looking at a hot liquor tank on the bottom right. The mash tun is on the top right, and then the kettle whirlpool is over on the left there. Another important consideration here is the venting. So this kettle is equipped with a condensate return stack, which means you basically will plumb that stack to a cold water supply, and all the steam that's evaporating off of your kettle during boil gets condensated, and then you run it down to the drain. If you pair this with an electric steam generator, you're able to design a completely ventless brew house. So we will do this configuration a lot of times if it's a historic building, if it's a location that's on the ground floor and may have condos above it. You don't want to go 6 stories up to vent everything. So we can actually make a very compact and vent-free system, which can be really convenient. That's probably one of my favorite setups that we do if it works for your space. So as I mentioned, combo systems are good for shrinking your footprint a little bit. and it's basically you're integrating that hot liquor tank and the mash tun. The drawback is inherently your hot liquor tank's going to be a little bit smaller. So typically we like to double size, at minimum double size our hot and cold liquor tanks, which means, for a 10 barrel brew house, you'd have a 20 barrel hot liquor tank. Typically on a combo system, that sizing's closer to 1.5 to 1.8. So you have a little less liquid to work with. It can, because of that, it's a little more difficult or time consuming to say double batch in a single day. With our standard 2-vessel configuration, we're usually looking at about a 6-hour brew day. With a combo system, if you were trying to double batch, it might be closer to 7.5 hours per turn. They are a little bit less flexible just because these are really specialty vessels at this point. The other consideration is for a combo system, they really can only be designed to work with steam. We can't direct fire heat the hot liquor tank when it's sitting underneath the mash tun, just due to the geometry and venting requirements there. So you are limited to steam only with those combo systems. But if you're in a brew pub or something like that, where everything's being served over the bar, you have a very small production area and you may be fighting for space with the kitchen, that kind of thing, these combo systems can be a great solution. So as I mentioned, kind of our standard is the 2-vessel system, which is a combination mash lauter and then a kettle whirlpool. When we refer to these 2-vessel systems, we're really talking about just the brew house. So obviously on our 2-vessel systems, there's actually a third, which would be at minimum your hot liquor tank. Could be 4 total vessels, including the hot and cold liquor tanks. But when we're talking about these systems as 1, 2, 3, or excuse me, 2, 3, 4 vessel, we're really excluding those hot and cold liquor tanks. These 2-vessel systems are really efficient at doing about 2 to 3 batches a day maximum. And I would say 3 is kind of pushing it. So we routinely do double batch brew days at our facility. And as I said, we're looking at typically from the first brewer coming in and mashing in to, walking away from a fully CIP'd system with 2 turns on that system. We're looking at anywhere between 10 to 12 hours, which is nice because you can have kind of 2 overlapping brew shifts where everyone's working an 8-hour day, or somebody can, do their hero shift and knock out a double batch. So they are also a little more flexible, just because you don't have that integration of the hot liquor tank. It does open you up to all of the heat sources that we talked about earlier, and they're easy to use. So the way that we design our systems, we don't typically do diverter panel systems, which basically have all of your valves in one central location. What we don't like about that design is it necessitates a lot more piping to bring everything to the front of the brew house and then return it back. So it ends up with a lot more things to clean. And then you still typically have to use some sort of U-fitting to make and break all these different connections. So what we do is we have, as I mentioned, kind of an integrated forward-facing pipe manifold where everything is hard piped, and our goal is for you not to have to make or break any connections, not to run any soft pipe, and be able to do everything that you need to do from mash in to CIP just by turning pumps on and off and manipulating valves. So we found that's been probably one of our biggest refinements on our brew house is really getting that piping dialed in, because every time you have to stop something, you have to find a hose, drag a hose. It takes up time. It's a tripping hazard. Those hoses wear out, so there's expense related there too. So again, based on our experience as brewers, that's the goal, is to make a system that's easy to use, it's efficient to use, and it's reliable. So these are a couple of examples of some 2 vessels. So this is kind of a linear, and then that triangle configuration that I was discussing earlier. The system on the top left there is a linear design, and you'll see it's got the double-sized hot and cold liquor tanks. Then moving on to the 3 vessel systems. These I typically only recommend if you are planning on every time you turn the system on, I'm going to brew at least twice, if not 3 times. They are efficient because as you're separating out these vessels, they're more dedicated vessels and it allows for more throughput. However, they are more complicated. As I mentioned earlier, they do typically require PLC controls with at least some pneumatic valves, because just by nature of design, some of that piping is going to be out of reach for your brewer. So some of those will need to be pneumatically driven. You also just have more processes happening simultaneously. So where on a 2 vessel system, one brewer can confidently double batch. If you're double batching on a 3 vessel system, you need to make sure that your brewer has a very keen attention to detail, or you may even have 2 people up on the deck. So with these vessels, we can really split them out any way that you want. And as I mentioned, sometimes to kind of break that 2+ turn daily rule, if you're doing a very specialized process, or you're, devoting your brand to a specific type of product, we can split these out however you'd like. We've made up to a 6 vessel system with 2 wort receivers. But generally what we see is either a mash mixer lauter tun with a kettle whirlpool, or a mash lauter tun with a dedicated kettle and whirlpool. However, like I said, we can always add additional wort receivers. We can do a mash mixer, lauter tun, kettle, and whirlpool. There's a lot of ways to do it, and it really just comes down to, again, how much beer are you going to make, how many times a day are you going to be brewing, and what kind of beer what kind of product are you going to be making. So example of a couple 3 vessels. So these are both mash mixer and then lauter tun designs. The one on the left just doesn't show, actually, excuse me, the one on the left has the mash mixer, lauter tun, kettle, and whirlpool, and then the one on the right shows the hot and cold liquor tanks, but then that's just a mash mixer, lauter tun, and kettle whirlpool. So how much beer do I need? Brewhouse turns. Again, hopefully you have this information in hand, or at least in mind, when you come to the table and start thinking about your brewhouse needs. I always recommend, again, start with a volume and we can kind of work backwards from there. So one of the things you're going to need to consider is your cellar, and what I call cellar algebra. You also want to consider your distribution split. So how much are you going to be selling in the tap room versus distribution? That's going to be a big driver of how much and how often you need to brew. Your turns per week versus your sales. So we want all of our craft beer to stay fresh. So we don't necessarily want to brew, say, 60 barrels of a hazy IPA that we're selling 2 barrels a week of. You want to be able to scale. And that's another thing to consider on the brew house side. So even if, say, you have a 30 barrel brew house, if you tell us, I may want to do some half batches, I may want to, split some things, what we can do is on the kettle, add a 3rd steam jacket. So that way you can basically, on a 30 barrel system, you could do a 10, 20, or 30 barrel batch based on the jackets that you're using in that kettle. The other big consideration is especially for kind of owner operators, leave time to manage the rest of your business. Work production, in the grand scheme of things, is a fairly minimal part of owning and operating a craft brewery. And you want to make that as easy as possible. Obviously, it is the lifeblood, it is what generates the product that you sell. But there's so much else that you have to do to own and operate and market a successful craft brewery. So our goal is to really make the brewing process as easy, painless, and quick as possible so that you have time to, promote your social media, to do your taxes, all of the stuff that isn't quite as, say, sexy as, the actual brewing process. We really want to make sure that you're set up for success and have that efficiency in place, because there's going to be so much else that you're going to have to devote your time to. We really want to make that as efficient as possible. So as far as kind of moving from the brew house to cellar design, you want to position for growth and you want to maintain flexibility. So positioning for growth means probably thinking about, again, how much beer you want to make in year 5. And when you run your glycol line, make sure you leave drops for those additional tanks that you want to bring in. So that way you don't have to shut down your entire production for a week when you get ready to grow, because you have to shut down your glycol chiller and add more lines. Also, sizing your glycol chiller. Make sure you have the size that is going to maintain your full cellar, not just your initial order. As far as flexibility, we do see a lot of people doing, say, split batch. So you may make one wort of a hazy IPA and then do 2 different dry hop approaches. So you may want to have a couple of half-size fermenters, meaning, 2 15-barrel fermenters for a 30-barrel brew house. Also consider unitanks versus a 2-tank method, which would be, your primary unitank fermentation and then transferring to a bright tank. I have a lot of really successful breweries using unitanks only, and they are a little bit more flexible. However, the yields from unitanks tend to be a little bit lower versus a dedicated unitank and then bright tank. Also, if you're packaging into cans, I typically recommend bright tanks. That allows you to both fine in line in your transfer to the bright tank. Our bright tanks are also built with racking arms, so that ensures that you're getting very clear product into the cans. Once a beer goes into a can and is out in market, you have no idea how that's going to be treated. All kinds of things can start to precipitate out. So you really want to make sure you have exceptionally clean, bright beer going into those tanks. We are also a certified ASME facility. So that means we can build you tanks that are suited for high pressure. So the kind of standard is a 14.9 psi or 1 bar tank. Does not require that ASME certification, and that's what most brewing equipment is, because that certification that certification process or stamp does cost some money. We build all of our 1 and 2 bar tanks exactly the same, but there is a additional about $3,000 cost if you want the stamp that says you can use this at 30 psi or 2 bar. For most beer production, that high pressure isn't necessary. So 15 psi on the tank will typically get you to, about the highest carbonation levels. Certainly that would ever go into cans. If you're maybe doing some specialty Belgian beers or seltzers, things like that need to be carbonated closer to, say, 3 volumes or above. Cider producers will also a lot of times do that. That's when you may want to consider some of these 2 3-bar tanks. And then touching on that cellar algebra that I mentioned earlier, basically, we're looking at the number of tanks times the volume divided by our turns per year. So for example, if I've got 6 20-barrel fermenters, I've got 52 weeks per year, and I can do 2.5 turns per week. So 2.5 turns refers to an ale fermentation. For a lager fermentation, you would want to, manipulate that to say 4 weeks or 6 weeks per turn. But using this example, if we're an all ale brewery, we've got 6 20-barrel fermenters, and we're brewing every week of the year, which also is not necessarily realistic. So a lot of times I'll recommend people, use 50 weeks per year, because you've got holidays, you're going to have some downtime. That'll give you kind of a more realistic look at your total production. But using this example of 6 20-barrel fermenters, we're brewing every week of the year. It's going to take us about 2.5 weeks per turn. That gets us to 416 barrels per year with those 6 20-barrel fermenters. Again, unitanks versus brights. One of the considerations there is floor space. The more tanks you have, obviously, they're going to take up more space. Bright tanks are more of a specialized kind of packaging vessel, so they're not quite as flexible as the unitanks. If you run out of space, you've got an open bright tank, you're not going to knock out from your brew house into a bright tank. So it requires a little more planning. It does require a little more floor space. It does, however, give you more, typically better yields and more flexibility on timing. So just some things to consider there. Another thing that we're seeing a lot of now, especially with the rise in lager production, is horizontal fermenters. Typically, on those horizontal fermenters, people are still doing primary in unitanks. It may only, however, be for 4 to 6 days, and then it's transferred into the horizontal to finish and then lager. With horizontals, I strongly recommend you ordering them as stacked pairs if you can, because one of the big drawbacks from a horizontal is if you only have a single, it's basically going to take up double the floor space as an equivalent sized unitank. However, if you stack them, that is then null and void, and you've kind of got all that space efficiency back. We've also actually seen these horizontals used for sour beer production. So if you're doing Brett primary or even long-term aging, those horizontals, it's a far, far less distance for yeast to flocculate, which is why they're really good for lager yeast and things that don't flocculate well. You're basically able to yield clear beer a lot quicker. Another thing to think about in that kind of transferring process, if you're going to be doing any fining, any filtering, centrifuging, inline carbonating, inline dosing with fruit, syrups, purees, that kind of thing, a lot of times that can be a lot easier to do from unitank to bright because of that racking arm in the bright tank. And another very important thing to think about on the cellar side is the importance of lead times. So as we all know, craft beer market is it's very fertile right now, but it's also very volatile. So I encourage everyone to strike while the iron is hot. If you have a brand that's doing really well, you want to capitalize on that and make sure you are keeping up with your production, because even if that product falls off the shelf for a couple of weeks, a lot of times you can see this exponential growth just kind of drop off, or at best you miss, a big window of opportunity. The same is true for, a really popular seasonal pumpkin beers. It's a very narrow window. They can be a huge, profit producer, but once they're done, they're done. So my kind of rule of thumb is each 2-week increase in lead time is a missed turn, at least if we're talking ales. So when you start to break that down, the profit from 2, 3, 4, 5 turns, So anywhere from, 4 to 10 weeks can actually equal the cost of a tank. So if you have a tank that's available now and it's $1,500 more, than a tank that's available in 10 weeks, a lot of times that tank that's available now is going to be much cheaper and actually end up earning you money before that other one would even arrive. And my last little soapbox is just kind of what to look for in suppliers, and this applies to both, brew houses and cellar tanks. Flexibility is a big one. What do you want, and what are they willing to do, and what are they willing to work with you on? So we, as I mentioned, we're a full custom shop. We'll build anything. We will probably have some, engineering input on uh, what you bring to the table, and we're not going to build you something that we don't believe in or think will work. But we also love solving problems, and a lot of that is born of our experience in the brewery. We do know that people are brewing a lot of innovative, beers. They're using new processes, new technology, and we're always happy to integrate that with our experience and our stock designs to make sure it is the right system for you. We've also done a lot of work in the kombucha space, cold brew coffee, distilling, CBD beverages. So we've seen a lot out there, and we have a pretty deep breadth of knowledge as to what works and what doesn't, and what can be integrated. Lead times, as I mentioned, less is more, right? The quicker you can get it, the better it is, as long as you can put it to use. Support is another big one to look for when you're talking to any equipment supplier. And support comes to experience, as I mentioned, kind of the breadth of knowledge base. Be clear on what's done in-house and what is outsourced, because that is going to be a big indicator of, if you're in a bind. If somebody outsourced their control panel build, they likely do not have those pieces in stock, which means if your control panel goes down, you've got a pump that's not working. Is it going to take weeks to replace that, or is it going to take hours or days? So definitely kind of push on that and figure out what is done in-house, what's outsourced, and make sure that replacement parts, that kind of thing, are readily available. Price is obviously a big consideration. Our goal at ABS Commercial is to kind of hit firmly in the middle of, we know the quality demands of a modern craft brewery. We also know what the budgetary constraints are. So our goal is to hit right in the middle of the best possible equipment that we can provide for a price that is attainable. And that's actually where our company was born out of, is when we were starting Raleigh Brewing Company, we couldn't find any supplier that met that balance. It was either very shoddy equipment that was competitively priced, or it was, quality equipment, but it was so astronomically expensive, we would have been sunk before we opened. So our whole business model is based on driving that quality up and getting it to a price that you can actually afford and use. The last little bit that I would recommend, and again, this kind of comes to just asking questions, is transparency in your suppliers. Know what's included in the purchase. We do see a lot of, especially with really budget suppliers, budget equipment, you may buy a fermenter that's, $3,000 less than one that we offer, but it doesn't have any valves, gauges, fittings, etc. on it. So by the time you actually get that tank outfit and ready to brew on, it's probably as expensive as ours. It's a lower quality piece of equipment. So just really, really probe your suppliers to make sure you know what's included, know what the support is. So you're at least comparing apples to apples with all this stuff. the last little, everyone's probably heard, whenever you're making any purchase, it can be good, cheap, and fast. You can have basically two of those. You're not going to get anything fast and good for cheap. You're not going to get anything fast and cheap that's good. So that's something to kind of consider when you're vetting all this stuff. If it looks too good to be true, it probably is. If it's too cheap for what you think you're getting, probably is.